It is my pleasure to introduce our second presenter, who's joining us through Skype, Nick Nesbitt, who is currently professor in the Department of French and Italian at Princeton University, as well as senior researcher in the Department of Philosophy at the Czech Academy of Sciences, starting this year and for 3 years. He has published extensively on Glissant, Marx, Althusser, Badiou, as well as monographs such as Voicing Memory, History and Subjectivity in French Caribbean Literature in 2003 with University of Virginia Press, Universal Emancipation, The Haitian Revolution and Radical Enlightenment in 2008 with Virginia again, and most recently in 2013, Caribbean Critique, Antillean Critical Theory from Toussaint to Glissant with Liverpool University Press.
Thank you. And thank you so much for making the effort, Andy and Emily, and so that I can take part in the conversation today. It's a real pleasure. My remarks today are reflective of the transformation, I'd say, that's going on in my own thinking about Glissant at the moment. In the last couple of years, I've been working intensively on readings of Marxist Capital, and in particular, Althusser's book, Reading Capital. I published a volume a couple of years ago on that, and that has begun to really move my thinking about Francophone studies in different directions. I think I have an extensive piece coming out in Small X, and their online version, SX, in a couple of weeks, on C.L.R. James and Marx and the problem of transition. So the problem of historicity from the perspective of the transition from slavery to capitalism, for example, and what James and Marx have to say about that. And so then returning for our discussion to Glissant's Discours entier, which for me remains his central theoretical text. I've been surprised to see that in a very different sense, and so I want to think a little bit, following on what John has just said about the event and the nature of the event in Glissant, my own perspective on that problem of historicity and transition comes less from Heidegger's thinking on the event, and even Deleuze's, although I've argued that Glissant's discussion of event has very interesting resonances with what Deleuze has to say about the event. For me, though, the problem of the event is productively thought through Badiou's philosophy, where the problem then becomes, I think, the historical problem becomes one of the movement, the transition, that is to say, from one situation, from one world to another. I think, for example, in 1804, the Haitian Revolution and the movement from a social structure based upon hierarchy, based upon a categorization, a discriminatory categorization of certain humans who are eligible to be enslaved, to be property, others, and never the same, who are eligible to be property holders, to, following that event, 1804, to a very different structuration of society, a flat, hierarchical, universal one in which no humans are eligible for the status of property, for enslavement. Anyway, as I return then to the Discours entier, thinking in that light, I see a very different text, and so a few remarks along those lines to put forward what then maybe we could further discuss in terms of the problem of structure and history. Are we okay?
Yes.
Everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Édouard Glissant tells us in Le Discours entier, this Martinican society appears as an immense accumulation of commodities amid a consumer society that has what I call a neo-feudal characteristic. immense accumulation of these 800 pages of Le Discours Entier is nothing less than what I'd call a critique of Martinican political economy. That is to say, a transcription, even a cannibalization of the project Marx set himself 150 years ago in Capital. And of course, a displacement to Martinique, to the Caribbean, to Antillean society. So what I want to suggest in this very initial sense is what I'd like to point to are some of the elements of this post-Marxian critique of political economy that I see outlined in Le Discours Entier.
Time's out after like 10 minutes, and then we have to log in again.
What we might even call scarecrow, or something like an Antillean structuralism.
But it's getting us off,
with
so.
Taking into account some of the limitations of that term, but just as a sort of shorthand.
See if it's working.
You
have the phone number for the IT guy, because maybe he can.
And so let me just say very quickly, let me just list a few of the sections of that book, where I see this sort of critique of Antillean political economy at work. Take a look, for example, at the pages Glissant writes on work, on non-production, on the preponderance of consumption in chapter 13, Faire et Créer. Look at what he writes on the notions of structure, explicitly structure and structuration. For example, in chapter 20, which is titled Structure et tension de groupe. Look constrains everything to the absolute demand to valorize value. Or otherwise, the obligation to realize constantly various secondary factors, regular increases in the production of surplus value. That's Marx. Here, as always, Glissant forges his own conceptual vocabulary. He operates his own cannibalization, his own production of the categories of his own thought, and doesn't speak explicitly of subsumption. Instead, he analyzes the predominance of an atavistic society, of talk, of barter society, but in the midst of global capitalism as it's developed in the last 2 centuries. Thirdly, this critical analysis is articulated around the reference and constant and regular interrogation of the true structure of Martinican society, in terms, that is to say, in terms of the forms and the adequate categories that would allow us to grasp the singular particularity of that society, which are, that is to say, non-apparent. They're not empirical factors, but rather what we could call structural factors. Finally, this original critique, Glissant articulates it around a systematic refusal of any inadequate politics that would fail to transform a society that Glissant diagnoses as morbid, and the refusal, moreover, of any politics that would be a mere acting out against colonialism, rather than a transition, a true transition, a true event, that is to say, a historical event, out of colonialism, an event that he, throughout the volume, diagnoses as having repeatedly failed to occur in Hegelian dynamic of the master and the slave finds itself short-circuited in this general fetishization. The metropole, in both the metropole, in the language of the other, cars, la frime, a series of fetishizations, a series of alienations, a barter society that exists in Martinique, which is manifestly the creation of French capitalism itself, which fails to progress, bears no real forces of production, and simply skims along the surface of universal commodification. The capitalist producer who captures surplus value thanks to his or her possession of the means of production and the domination of the forces of production is inexistent. Antillean consumer society, la société de consommation antillaise, without real production, only manages to produce the circulation of capital in the form of commodities produced elsewhere. Here's Glissant. On importe ce qu'on ne crée ou ne fabrique pas, et on cesse de fabriquer pour importer. On remplace la notion de production par la notion de service. On exporte la force du travail, and Glissant concludes, on permet à une fraction du capitalisme marchand français d'opérer en Martinique une fructueuse plus-value commerciale. And so we see in this analysis, in this critique, a systematic refocalization in Martinique of investment, from the development of infrastructures that is key for Glissant's analysis. And so-called primitive accumulation that Marx had described in the culminating pages of Capital, a history written, Marx says, famously, written in the annals of humanity in letters of blood and fire, in indelible letters of blood and fire, finds itself rewritten, transformed, rethought in singular form in the Antilles in Glissant's analysis, in the form that Glissant names dispossession, dépossession. So this term, dépossession, covers a whole series of phenomena for Glissant, from the ultra-violence of slavery itself, culminating in the general alienation of late 20th century consumer society and the frenzy of that consumer society. And the concept of dispossession indicates in all its depth a general dispossession of Antillean society from means of production, just as surely as it did for Marx in Scotland of the 18th century and the crofters, his historical example, of course, in the end of Capital. So, in this process of dispossession, in Glissant's reading, the Vété played the preponderant role in his analysis. It's one of the most interesting aspects of his critique, I think. The Vété are not at all for him an expropriating class, but they're simply a sort of fetishized paravent that hides the true
Let's see.
Yes, I think we should.
Wrap it up?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let me just skip ahead and say there are some really interesting passages where Glissant talks about explicitly about the structure and the structuration of Martinican political economy, and for me, in terms that are a rewriting, a critical rethinking of the Marxist structuralism of the 60s, thinkers like Althusser and Balibar. I think that Glissant is working with this dominant mode of analysis at the time in the 60s and 70s and doing very interesting things with it. And he's explicitly doing so not by footnoting Althusser or Balibar, but rather in the appropriation of certain terms, certain modes of analysis, such as that of the structure of Antillean society. Okay, so to conclude, 2 points. One is a reservation, another an appreciation. I think that despite the originality of this critique of Martinican political economy that we see in Discourtier, there's still a really significant ambiguity in the analysis. I think it's never clear whether Glissant attributes the negative structuration of that society to impersonal forces of capital, French capital, or rather to individuals, bad capitalists. I think that you can read that either way. There's a sort of heterodox nature to the different passages that I'm sort of cherry picking throughout the 800 pages, and this ambiguity that vacillates between what I'd call a structural analysis and a sort of humanist critique of political economy suggests another ambiguity, but I think it's the second one indicates, in fact, the real actuality of this book among its many continuing interesting and compelling features. So Glissant, in the middle of the 70s, for him, the case of Martinique seems, he argues that it's singular. He only compares it in this analysis to the other late colonial systems, such as Micronesia, without a productive class that one could call, that he would call, that he denies existing, that is a proletarian class. There's the predominance of the tertiary sector of consumption, consumerism, without the injection of fictive capital to sustain it. What remains is simply the capture of surplus value by delocalization. So from all these points of view, and I just have two sentences, from all these points of view, the singularity of Martinique hardly seems determinate 40 years later. We might think it's dépassé. But if Glissant takes apart so precisely, so powerfully, the system and structure of Martinican political economy to reveal its contradictions, its internal hidden contradictions in late colonialism, I think for a long time elsewhere we've entered into, on a global level, in the tout monde, that is to say, a general crisis in the production of surplus value, a general crisis in global capital, and in fact, the systematic elimination of living labor, for example, from global production. Its only real substance of value, according to Marx, in global capitalism, there's only a survival of the system that occurs through the regular injection of fictive capital, just as Glissant is already analyzing in Martinique, in the restrained close example of Martinique in the 1960s and 70s. And so we live throughout the world analysis that he carries out on Martinique in the 70s that for many years now we have all been Martinique.
Mm,
Thanks.